The Bench, February 1943. A Wehrmacht workshop company somewhere behind the Tunisian front, in the weeks after Kasserine Pass. Kasserine was the worst defeat the United States Army suffered in the West. 6,000 American casualties in 5 days. Units scattered across 30 miles of desert. Equipment abandoned in a panicked retreat, in quantities that made German intelligence officers genuinely happy. And in among the abandoned equipment, towed in or driven in under its own power, was a small, ugly, flat-fendered four-wheel drive car. The Germans had seen them before. They had been arriving in North Africa with the British for over a year, sent under Lend-Lease. But now, there were enough of them, and enough spares, and enough time for somebody in a workshop unit to do the thing engineers do, which is take one completely apart and lay the pieces out on a bench. There is no famous document from that afternoon. I want to be straight with you about that up front. No captured report with a stamp on it that says, "Here is what we found." If somebody wrote one, it did not survive, and I am not going to invent it for you. But there is something better, and it is sitting right there on the bench in front of them. Because if you had disassembled a captured American Jeep in 1943, you would have found that some of the components carried a small stamped script letter F, and some of them did not. The ones with the F were made by the Ford Motor Company. The ones without were made by Willys Overland. 2 different corporations. 2 different factories, hundreds of miles apart. Competitors who had bid against each other for the contract. And the parts were in the same vehicle, fitted together, working. Nobody had filed anything to make them fit. Nobody had shimmed anything. No craftsman had sat with a micrometer and matched a bearing to a housing. The parts fit because they had been made to fit, at the machine tool, 4,000 miles away, by 2 organizations that did not like each other. That is the whole story, and every German engineer in that tent would have understood the implication in about 4 seconds. Because they had been trying to do that in Germany for 5 years, and they had failed. Part 2, 49 days before we get to the failure, understand what was actually on that bench, because the Jeep's reputation has drifted into mythology, and the mythology gets it backwards. The Jeep was not an engineering marvel. That has to be said plainly. In June 1940, with France collapsing, the U.S. Army issued a specification for a light reconnaissance car, 4-wheel drive, a payload of 600 pounds, a weight limit the Army initially set so low that it was, in the opinion of every manufacturer who looked at it, physically impossible. Delivery of a running prototype in 49 days. The Army solicited something like 135 companies. 3 answered. One of them was the American Bantam Car Company of Butler, Pennsylvania, a firm that built tiny licensed British economy cars, was close to bankrupt, and had almost no engineering staff left. They brought in a freelance engineer from Detroit named Karl Probst, who at first agreed to work without pay. Probst laid out the design in about 5 days. Bantam delivered a running prototype to the Army test ground at Camp Holabird, Maryland, on the 49th day. Then the Army did something that a lot of people still find offensive, and I think you should hear it plainly. They took Bantam's design and handed it to Willys Overland and to Ford, so those larger companies could build competing versions. Bantam had done the work. Bantam did not get the war. They built a couple of thousand of the early cars, and then spent the rest of the conflict making trailers. Willys refined it, and crucially fitted their own engine, a 4-cylinder side valve unit called the Go Devil, around 60 horsepower, which does not sound like much and was the most powerful of the 3 submissions. The Army standardized on the Willys design, and then they told Ford to build it. Not a Ford version of it, to Willys drawings. Now look at the finished object. 2,400 pounds, 80-inch wheelbase. 4 men could physically pick it up and turn it around. No armor, no weapon as standard, a flat windshield that folded down, a canvas top most crews threw away, and an engine that would have been unremarkable in a 1935 sedan. There is nothing on that bench a German engineer would have envied. The metallurgy was ordinary. The tolerances were, by German standards, loose. The transmission was not as refined as a German transmission. If you had asked a Stower or a BMW engineer to build a better light car than this, he could have done it, and he would have enjoyed doing it. That is exactly the point. The Jeep was not built to be the best light vehicle in the world. It was built to be the most repairable one, and those two goals are in direct opposition, and only one army in the world had made peace with that. Part 3. The F on the bolt. The idea on that bench is more than 100 years older than the war. In the 1820s, at the United States National Armories, Harper's Ferry and Springfield, American gunmakers were pushed toward something the great European workshops had never bothered to pursue, because European workshops had something America did not have, which was a deep supply of highly trained craftsmen. The American approach was to move the skill out of the man and into the machine tool. Build a jig, build a gauge, make the machine hold the tolerance so the worker does not have to. Do that well enough, and any part fits any assembly, made by anyone, anywhere, at any time. It worked, and it worked so visibly that in 1854 the British government sent a parliamentary commission across the Atlantic specifically to study how the Americans were doing it, and came home and re-equipped the Enfield Armory with American machine tools. They gave the method a name that stuck, the American System of Manufactures. So Europe was not ignorant of this. Europe had it in a report, in English, in 1854. By 1940, the method was so deeply normal in the United States that Americans no longer experienced it as a doctrine. It was just how things were made. And when the Army ordered Ford to build Willys' vehicle, it did not occur to anybody in the room that this was a remarkable instruction. They simply required that the parts interchange and inspected until they did. Then they built about 647,000 of them. Roughly 360,000 from Willys, roughly 277,000 from Ford, for something under $1,000 each. Here is what that means in a field in Normandy. A Jeep brakes, half shaft, water pump, distributor, whatever. The driver is not a mechanic. He is a 19-year-old who drove a delivery truck in Missouri 18 months ago. He does not diagnose it to component level with any subtlety. He pulls the broken thing off, opens a wooden crate, takes out the new thing, bolts it on. He does not know whether the vehicle came from Toledo or from Dearborn. He does not need to know. He does not look at the part number to check compatibility, because there is no incompatibility to check for. There is one Jeep. There has only ever been one Jeep. And when he cannot get a crate, he walks over to the Jeep that got shot up yesterday and takes the part off that one, because that one is also the same Jeep. The men in this story are a bankrupt car company, a freelance draftsman, and a lot of teenagers with wrenches. Nobody has ever built them a monument. If you think that's worth fixing, hit the like button. It takes a second, and it keeps them in front of people who care about getting this right. Part 4. What the Germans already knew. Now the part that answers the question in the title, and it turns out the Germans did not need to take a Jeep apart to know any of this. They had said it out loud, officially, in 1938. By the late 30s, the German army's motor transport situation had become a scandal inside its own general staff. The Wehrmacht was operating an enormous and chaotic collection of vehicle types. Different manufacturers, different models, different engines, different everything. Because German motor manufacturing was a landscape of proud independent firms, each with its own engineering tradition, its own foundry practice, and its own idea of how a truck should be built. The result was a spare parts catalog that no army could actually run on. So in 1938, the German High Command appointed a general named Adolf von Schell as plenipotentiary for motor vehicles, with a mandate to fix it. What became known as the Schell Plan was an attempt to slash the number of approved vehicle types drastically, to take a chaotic list of truck and car models and force it down to a small standardized range. Read that again, because it matters. German engineers had identified the exact problem, named it, given a general the authority to solve it, and started work 5 years before Kasserine. It did not work. Some of the reduction happened on paper. But then Germany conquered France, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Poland, and much of the Western Soviet Union, and every conquest poured captured foreign vehicles into the inventory. French trucks, Czech trucks, Italian, Austrian, Russian, each with its own parts, its own threads, its own tooling, and no supply chain behind it. The Wehrmacht that invaded Russia in 1941 also brought upward of 600,000 horses and used something in the region of 2.75 million animals over the course of the war, because there was never enough motor transport to go around. and there is one object that makes the whole thing painfully clear. The Germans built a purpose-designed light military car. It was called the Leichter Einheits PKW. Einheit means unit, uniform, standardized. It is right there in the name. The standardized car. It was built by 3 different manufacturers, Stover, BMW, and Hanomag. They used different engines. The vehicle whose name was standardized was, across its 3 builders, not fully interchangeable. It was also complicated. Early versions had 4-wheel steering, which is wonderful engineering and an ongoing maintenance problem, and it was heavy, and it was expensive, and it took far too long to build. In 1943 they cancelled it, and fell back on the cheaper alternative, Ferdinand Porsche's Kübelwagen, built on the Volkswagen platform. And to be fair to it, the Kübelwagen was a good vehicle, light, air-cooled, so no radiator to freeze in Russia, simple, and much better across country than its 2-driven wheels suggest. It was not a failure. But it was not 4-wheel drive, and they built about 50,000 of them. 50,000 against 647,000. If your father or grandfather was a driver, a motor pool mechanic, an ordnance company man, or anyone who spent the war keeping wheels turning rather than firing at anybody, I'd genuinely like to know. Unit, theater, and anything he said about the vehicles. That work almost never gets written down, and the families are usually the last people holding it. Part 5. 2 Doctrines of Repair. Everything above comes down to a single divergence in what the word repair means. In the German tradition, and this is a genuinely great tradition, one that produced some of the finest machinery ever made, repair is a skilled act. A trained man assesses the fault, and where a replacement part does not quite fit, he makes it fit. He files, he scrapes, he shims. He may make the part himself. The craftsman is not a weakness in the system. The craftsman is the system, and the machine is designed on the assumption that he will be there. In the American system, repair is a transaction. Identify the failed assembly, remove it, fit the new one. Nothing is adjusted, because nothing needs adjusting, because the tolerance was already handled in Ohio by a machine. Both work, but only one of them survives being shipped 4,000 miles. Craft repair requires craftsmen, and craftsmen take years to train, and by 1944 Germany was feeding its trained men into the infantry because it had run out of infantry. Craft repair also requires a workshop, tooling, and time, and Allied air power had made daylight movement lethal and destroyed the rail network that connected forward units to rear workshops. Transaction repair requires a crate and a wrench and a kid. Germany could not produce the kids version because you cannot switch to it in wartime. Interchangeability is not a decision you make about a vehicle. It is a decision you made decades earlier about your machine tools, your gauging, your inspection standards, and your entire industrial culture, and by 1943 that decision was long since closed. They did the next best thing. They used the Jeeps. Captured Jeeps were prized, driven by German units across every front where they could be got, and kept running as long as spares lasted, which was not long, because the one thing they could not capture was the crate. And in December 1944, in the Ardennes, Otto Skorzeny put German commandos in American uniforms into captured Jeeps and sent them through the American lines to cause confusion. It worked for a while, well enough that American sentries started demanding baseball scores and state capitals from anyone who drove up. The Germans could steal the vehicle. They could not steal what stood behind it. Verdict. The verdict on the Jeep is not a verdict about a vehicle at all, and this is where the whole thing turns over. German engineering asked, how good can we make this object? American engineering asked, in how many places, by how many people, with how little skill, can this object be put back into service? Those are different questions, and the second one sounds smaller and is not. The second question contains a hidden assumption that the Americans made and the Germans could not afford to make, that the war would be fought a very long way from the factory, by people who had never worked in one. By that measure, the Jeep is one of the most successful designs in the history of engineering, and almost nothing about it is clever. There is no innovation in it. The four-wheel drive was not new. The engine was ordinary. The bodywork was flat panels, because flat panels are quick to press. The genius is entirely in the fact that the thing that came out of the Ford plant and the thing that came out of the Willys plant were, to the level of a bolt, the same object. Eisenhower, asked after the war which tools had won it, did not name a tank or a fighter. He named the bulldozer, the Jeep, the 2.5-ton truck, and the C-47 transport aircraft. Not one of them fires a shot. George Marshall called the Jeep America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. Ernie Pyle, who spent more time riding in them than almost any correspondent alive, wrote that it was as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat. And the men who actually made it possible got almost nothing. Karl Probst drew the thing in about 5 days, initially for no money, and is not a household name in any household. The American Bantam Car Company of Butler, Pennsylvania, a nearly bankrupt firm that answered a call 132 other companies ignored and met an impossible deadline with 49 days and a freelancer, had its design handed to its competitors and spent the war building trailers. It never recovered. The company is gone. 647,000 Jeeps, and the people who made the first one got a trailer contract. That is not a happy ending, and I am not going to dress it up as one. But it is, in a strange way, the most American detail in the entire story, because the system did not reward the inventor. It rewarded the copy. It was built to reward the copy. That is what interchangeability is. A decision that the individual object, and by extension the individual maker, does not matter, because everything must be replaceable by something identical. That decision cost Bantam its future. It also meant that when a Jeep broke down in a hedgerow in July 1944, a 19-year-old could open a wooden box and have it running again in 20 minutes, and drive it to wherever the next man needed to be. Both of those things are true, and you do not get one without the other. If this audit gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It puts this in front of the people who want the history the way it actually worked. Subscribe if you want the next one, because there are more of these. More designs everybody agreed were crude. More men who solved something enormous and got nothing for it. And remember what the Germans on that bench in Tunisia understood the moment they saw two makers' parts in one machine. They were not looking at a car. They were looking at 120 years of decisions they had chosen not to make.